The gun was already pressed against Matilda Wells's temple when Clayton Barker walked through the saloon door. She did not flinch. She did not beg. She stood perfectly still behind the bar with her hands raised to shoulder height, and her eyes, those impossible dark eyes that had been haunting Clayton's sleep for the better part of 3 months, were fixed on the man holding the weapon with something that looked far less like fear and far more like cold, calculated fury. "You thought you could hide from me all the way out here." The man holding the gun was named Deacon Prout, and he had ridden 400 miles through 2 territories to find her. His voice cracked at the edges the way a man's voice does when he has convinced himself that obsession is the same thing as love. "All the way to the end of the earth, and you thought I wouldn't follow?" "Put the gun down," Clayton said from the doorway, his voice level and quiet in a way that made every man in the saloon go absolutely still. Prout's eyes cut sideways toward him. "This doesn't concern you, Barker. The moment you put a weapon to someone's head inside the town limits of Redemption, it concerned me." Clayton took one slow step forward. He was the sheriff of Redemption, Colorado. He had been for 3 years. He was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders, and he had learned long ago that the quality most useful to a lawman was not speed and not strength, but the unshakable ability to remain calm while the world dissolved into chaos around him. "Lower the weapon. Last time I'll say it gently." Matilda Wells did not look at Clayton. She kept her eyes on Prout's face. And Clayton, even in that terrible compressed moment, noticed something that did not quite make sense to him yet. She was not looking at Prout with fear. She was measuring him, calculating. She was waiting for something, and whatever it was, she seemed very certain it would come. It came in the form of Prout's grip shifting, just a fraction, as he turned more of his attention toward Clayton. Matilda moved like water. Her left hand came down in a single precise arc and knocked the gun sideways. The shot discharged into the ceiling, showering plaster dust, and in the half-second that followed, Clayton crossed the distance between them with 3 long strides and had Prout's wrist locked behind his back before the man could redirect the weapon. The saloon held its collective breath. Then it exhaled all at once in a cascade of noise: men talking, someone laughing nervously, a bottle being set down too hard on a table. Clayton clicked the iron cuffs onto Prout's wrists and looked up at Matilda Wells over the man's shoulder. She was brushing plaster dust from the lapels of her coat. It was a woman's coat, dark wool, well-made, slightly too large across the shoulders for her narrow frame. The sleeves were worn at the cuffs in a way that suggested it had seen years of use before it ever came to her. And there was something about the way she wore it, something careful and deliberate, that told Clayton Barker it meant more than warmth. He did not ask about the coat. He did not ask about the man who had ridden 400 miles to find her, or what secret she was carrying that had driven her from wherever she'd begun to this small, struggling town at the edge of the Colorado wilderness. He simply said, "You all right?" Matilda Wells met his gaze. "I'm perfectly fine," she said. "Thank you for the assistance, though I had it largely under control." Clayton almost smiled. "I noticed that," he said. "That was 3 months ago." Now he needed to understand how they had arrived here, at this place, at this moment, and at everything that had quietly and irreversibly changed between them in the weeks that came before and after. Matilda Wells had come into Redemption, Colorado on the 2nd Tuesday of September, 1883, on the afternoon stage from Pueblo. She had been the only passenger, which the driver mentioned to anyone who would listen at the station, because it was unusual enough to be worth noting. A woman traveling alone, no luggage to speak of beyond a single worn valise and a leather satchel she carried herself and never set down. She had walked directly from the stage depot to the general store, purchased 3 days' worth of provisions: dried beans, salt pork, coffee, a small paper of sugar, and then, without asking anyone for directions or permission, had walked through the town to the building at the far end of Main Street that had a faded sign reading Redemption Gazette above the door, and had knocked. The man who owned the Gazette was named Herbert Odom, and he was 63 years old and had been trying to run a newspaper in Redemption since 1879, with varying degrees of failure. He had placed an advertisement in papers as far east as Kansas City for an assistant who could set type, manage the press, write copy, and keep his accounts, and he had received exactly 0 responses in 8 months. Matilda Wells had not seen the advertisement. She had simply heard in Pueblo, from a woman at a boarding house, that the town of Redemption had a newspaper run by one man who was struggling to keep it alive, and she had calculated that a struggling enterprise was more likely to take a chance on a woman than a successful one. She was right. Herbert Odom took one look at her, the coat, the direct gaze, the way she set her valise down like it was a decision rather than a necessity, and said, "Can you set type?" "Yes," she said. "Can you write?" he asked. "Better than most men you've met," she said without apology. He hired her on the spot. He also helped her find a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Eunice Crane, who had 2 spare rooms and a particular policy about unmarried women that she modified slightly after speaking with Matilda for approximately 4 minutes. Matilda Wells had that effect on people. She arrived at situations, and they rearranged themselves to accommodate her with a minimum of resistance, as if she carried some internal quality of inevitability that made opposition feel more trouble than it was worth. Clayton Barker had noticed her on her second day in Redemption. He noticed most things, it was his job and his nature, but he noticed Matilda with a particular quality of attention that was different from professional observation, and that he spent considerable energy pretending was not. She was 26 years old, though he wouldn't know that until later. She had dark hair that she kept pinned in a practical knot that sometimes, toward the end of the afternoon when she'd been bending over type cases all day, began to work itself loose in a way she didn't always notice. She was slender and capable-looking, with hands that were ink-stained within a week of arriving at the Gazette, and stayed that way. She had a quality of focused stillness that made her seem larger than her actual size, and a way of listening to people genuinely listening, not waiting for her turn to speak, that made them tell her things they hadn't intended to. She was also, clearly, carrying a significant secret, possibly several. Clayton was experienced enough with human nature to recognize the particular posture of someone who had reinvented themselves. It wasn't dishonest, exactly. It was more like deliberate, as though she had chosen, very carefully, what portions of herself to carry forward and what to leave behind in whatever place she'd come from. He did not ask. It was not his place. And there was something about the asking that felt, to him, like it would break something delicate that he found himself, strangely, wanting to protect. He did start coming into the Gazette more often than his official duties required. He told himself it was because Herbert Odom occasionally printed things that needed checking for accuracy. Herbert was enthusiastic but not always careful about fact. The previous spring, he had nearly caused a property dispute between 2 ranchers by printing an erroneous description of a fence line that turned out to be about 40 yards off. Clayton had smoothed that particular difficulty over and had been in the habit of stopping by the Gazette since. He kept telling himself this for approximately 3 weeks before he accepted that it was not the reason. The reason he kept coming by was that Matilda Wells would look up from whatever she was doing, setting type, reading proof, writing copy in her quick, economical hand, and she would say something intelligent and unexpected that made him want to hear what she would say next. She said once, "This town has good bones, but it doesn't know what it wants to be yet." She said, another time, "The problem with your martial system as it stands is that you're one man covering a territory that needs 3. You're compensating with reputation, which works until it doesn't." She said on a cold October afternoon while rain beat against the Gazette's single narrow window and Clayton was ostensibly reviewing copy about a land sale dispute, "You're not actually reading that, are you?" He looked up. She was watching him with an expression of faint, warm amusement that she didn't try to conceal. "No," he admitted. "What are you thinking about?" He considered a careful answer. He gave her the honest one instead. You. The amusement shifted into something quieter and more serious. She looked back at her type case. That seems unwise, she said. Probably, he agreed, but he kept coming back. The town of Redemption was a real place with real problems, and Clayton Barker was deeply embedded in most of them in his capacity as sheriff. There was the ongoing issue of the Harlow brothers, two cattle ranchers whose disagreement about a water source on shared property had been simmering for a year and occasionally boiled over into threats and once into actual gunfire, though fortunately aimed at fence posts rather than people. There was a gambling operation being run out of the back of the Silver Spur Saloon that was technically illegal, but that Clayton had been working to dismantle gradually rather than dramatically, because dramatic interventions in gambling operations in 1883 Colorado had a history of producing worse chaos than they resolved. There was a circuit judge due in November to hear 3 cases, 2 of them involving men currently sitting in Clayton's jail cells, and there was a territorial marshal who kept sending letters suggesting that Redemption needed to build a proper jail rather than using the 2-room outbuilding behind the sheriff's office. Clayton handled all of these things with the same steady, methodical attention he brought to everything. He was not a flashy man. He had never sought fame or legend, and he was quietly disgusted by the magazine serials that portrayed Western lawmen as magnificent and romantic. The job was mostly paperwork, negotiation, and the patient, unglamorous work of maintaining enough order in a frontier community that people could get on with their lives. Matilda Wells began to appear in his professional life as well as his personal one because she was, it turned out, a genuinely excellent journalist. Her first major piece for the Gazette was about the water rights dispute between the Harlow brothers. She had, without mentioning it to anyone, gone and interviewed both brothers separately, reviewed the original land survey documents at the county office, and produced a piece that laid out the actual legal situation with a clarity that the brothers themselves found difficult to argue with. It did not resolve the dispute. Nothing short of the circuit judge was going to do that, but it reframed it in a way that made both men feel their position was understood, which took some of the heat out of the confrontation. Clayton read it and came to the Gazette. That was careful work, he said. Matilda was cleaning ink from the press rollers. She accepted the compliment without deflecting it, which he had noticed was characteristic of her. She didn't minimize her own competence. Someone needed to write it clearly, she said. The 2 brothers have been so deep in it for so long they've lost track of what they're actually arguing about. Which is their father, she said simply. He left them the land in a will that was ambiguous enough to allow both of them to claim what they wanted. The water source is the focus because it's tangible. The real dispute is about which one of them he favored. She paused, still working at the roller with a rag. Fathers do that to their children sometimes. Leave ambiguity where they should have left clarity. There was something in her voice when she said it that Clayton filed away without pressing on. You think the article will help? He asked. I think it might, she said. Sometimes people need to see a thing written down to believe it's real, or to believe that other people can see it too. He watched her hands moving over the press. Where did you learn to be a journalist? She was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone who hadn't heard the question, but the silence of someone choosing their answer. I learned to read very young, she said at last, and I never stopped. Everything else followed from that. It was not the full answer to his question. He knew it. She knew he knew it. But neither of them pushed further, and this became, gradually, one of the foundational agreements of whatever was developing between them, that they would tell each other the truth, but they would not demand all of it at once. October moved into November with the cold coming down from the mountains in earnest. The aspens had long since turned and lost their leaves, and the mornings in Redemption arrived with frost on the windows and ice in the water barrels that needed breaking before anyone could wash. Matilda Wells did not complain about the cold. She wore her coat, that large dark wool coat, everywhere she went, and Clayton observed that she seemed, in some way he couldn't articulate, more herself in it than she would have been without it. He was walking with her one evening in early November. They had taken to occasionally walking after dinner, a habit that had begun without formal acknowledgement and had simply continued, when she said, out of an apparently clear sky, "I should tell you something." The air was very cold and their breath made small clouds. The town was quiet around them, the distant sound of the Silver Spurs piano carrying faintly on the wind. Clayton matched his pace to hers and waited. "My name is Matilda Wells," she said. "That's true, but until 8 months ago I was Matilda Prout." He absorbed this. "Prout," he said. "Wife of Gerald Prout," she said. "Of St. Louis. He was a prosperous man, a merchant. I was 23 when I married him and I believed him to be a man of honest character." A pause. "I was wrong." "What did he do?" Clayton asked. "Many things over 3 years," she said. Her voice was level. He was beginning to understand, a remarkable capacity to discuss painful things without dramatizing them. Some of them were things that marriage laws in 1883 don't classify as crimes because the law assumes a husband's authority over his wife is absolute. Some of them were things I couldn't prove. Some of them were simply the slow, deliberate work of making a person feel that they are less than what they are. Clayton said nothing. He let the silence hold the weight of what she'd said. "He had a brother," she continued, "Deacon, who always frightened me more than Gerald did because at least with Gerald there was a veneer of respectability. Deacon has no veneer." She glanced sideways at him. "I think you've surmised who Deacon is." "The man from Kansas City," Clayton said. "Yes." She stopped walking. They were at the edge of town now, where the buildings gave way to open land and the sky was enormous and full of stars. "Gerald died in March, fever. It was a very strange experience being a widow at 26. I thought I was free, but the estate was complicated and Deacon had ideas about what he was owed, and I realized quite quickly that Gerald's death had not made me free at all, so I ran." "With nothing?" Clayton asked. "With almost nothing," she said. "My own clothes. A little money I had saved, which took some cunning to manage given that Gerald controlled the household accounts. And a coat." She looked down at the dark wool coat she was wearing. "It belonged to a woman named Clara Hendricks. She was a neighbor of mine in St. Louis who had been kind to me, who had seen more than she said. She died of influenza in February, 2 weeks before Gerald. Her husband, who was not a bad man but was overwhelmed, let me sort through her things. I took the coat because it was warm and practical and because it was Clara's, and Clara had been brave in small ways every single day, and I thought that wearing her coat might remind me to do the same." She said it matter-of-factly, but Clayton felt the weight of it settle over him like a hand placed gently on his shoulder. "Did it," he asked, "remind you?" She considered the question with the seriousness she brought to everything. "Yes," she said, "I think it did." They stood in the cold and the dark and the extraordinary quiet of the Colorado night, and Clayton Barker looked at Matilda Wells and felt something shift in him that he understood was not going back. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I thought you deserved to know," she said. "Given," she stopped. "Given what?" he asked. "Given that you keep walking with me," she said, "in the cold after dinner every evening, and that you look at me the way you do." She said it without coyness, just the statement of a fact. "I thought honesty was warranted." "It's always warranted," he said. She looked at him then, fully and directly in the way she had of looking at people that made you feel you were being seen all the way through. "You're a very unusual man, Clayton Barker." "Am I?" "Most men would have asked more questions by now," she said. "About the coat, about where I came from, about Deacon when you locked him up. You asked none of them." "I figured you'd tell me what you wanted me to know when you wanted me to know it," he said. "I'm not in the habit of demanding things from people." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised him. "Gerald demanded everything, every explanation, every movement, every thought." Another pause. "Your patience has felt like a gift. I want you to know I noticed it." He wanted to say a great many things then. He restrained himself. "It's cold," he said. "I should walk you back to Eunice's." She smiled, a real smile, wide and unguarded, the kind he'd rarely seen from her, and fell into step beside him, and they walked back through the frosted streets of Redemption together, close enough that their shoulders occasionally touched. In the days after Deacon Pruitt's arrest, things moved with the particular velocity of frontier justice. Clayton held Pruitt in the jail, and when the circuit judge arrived in mid-November, the case was presented simply and clearly. Deacon Pruitt had traveled from Missouri to Colorado and entered a public establishment and held a weapon to the head of a woman against whom he had no legal claim and who had no legal obligation to him whatsoever. The judge, a grizzled man named Harcastle who had been riding this circuit for 15 years and had seen nearly everything, listened to the facts and sentenced Pruitt to 18 months in the territorial prison at Canyon City. Pruitt, being let out, stopped and looked at Matilda, who was sitting in the first row of the courtroom with her ink-stained hands folded in her lap and her expression composed and watchful. "You think you're free," he said. "Gerald's estate is settled," Matilda said. "I filed the papers in September. A very competent attorney in Pueblo helped me understand what I was entitled to as Gerald's legal widow, regardless of your claims. I suggest you consult a lawyer when your 18 months are completed, and he will explain to you what I imagine you'll find disappointing." Pruitt stared at her. Then he was guided firmly through the door by the bailiff, and that was the last Redemption saw of him. Clayton caught Matilda's eye as she rose from her seat. He could see the effort it had taken, the compressed time of holding herself still and steady and unbending, in the presence of the man who represented everything she had escaped. He could see the faintest tremor in her jaw that she controlled by holding it very slightly set. "Walk," he said simply. She exhaled. "Please," she said. They walked for a long time that afternoon, through the town and out beyond it into the frozen meadowland, not saying a great deal, just moving through the cold air while the November sky pressed down in deep gray layers overhead. At some point, Matilda began to talk, not about Pruitt or Gerald or St. Louis, but about a book she had been reading, a collection of essays by a woman named Mary Wollstonecraft, and about what she thought Western expansion might ultimately mean for the people already living on the land it was expanding into, and about the small injustices she had noticed in Redemption. The way the Chinese laundry workers were paid less than anyone else for longer hours. The way the two Navajo men who occasionally came into town to trade were watched with a suspicion that was never extended to white men of equivalent appearance. She had an instinct for injustice that was both intellectual and deeply personal. Clayton understood where it came from. When you had been on the receiving end of power wielded carelessly or cruelly, you noticed when you saw it happening to others. "You should write about it," he said. "Herbert is nervous about controversy," she said. "Herbert is nervous about a lot of things," Clayton said, "but he's not a coward. If you write it well, he'll print it." She glanced at him. "Are you encouraging me toward trouble, Sheriff?" "I'm encouraging you toward honesty," he said, "which sometimes looks like trouble from a distance." She laughed. It was a full, genuine laugh, the kind that surprised you with its warmth. He thought it was possibly the most beautiful thing he had heard in a very long time. December arrived, and with it a change in the quality of everything. Matilda wrote 2 pieces that ran in the Gazette in December that caused a significant amount of conversation in Redemption. The first was about the wage disparity facing the town's Chinese residents, written with careful specificity. She had interviewed 6 of the laundry workers with the assistance of a young man named Lee who spoke both Cantonese and English, and who agreed to translate after Matilda spent 2 weeks earning his trust through consistent respect. The second piece was about the treatment of indigenous traders at the town's general store, where the owner, a man named Purvis, routinely overcharged anyone he suspected of being unable to read the price tags. Both pieces caused controversy. Purvis came into the sheriff's office and complained to Clayton about the newspaper woman who was stirring up trouble. Clayton listened politely, took notes, and pointed out that the behavior described in the article, if accurate, constituted a form of fraud, and that Purvis might wish to review his pricing structure voluntarily before the matter required a more official review. Purvis left looking thoughtful and unhappy. Matilda, when Clayton told her this, stopped in the middle of pouring herself coffee and looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before, something soft and wondering, as if he had done something she hadn't expected to find possible. "You backed me up," she said. "Of course I did," he said. "You were right. A lot of men would have come and told me to be less troublesome," she said. "A lot of men are fools," he said mildly. She set the coffee pot down. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Clayton," just his name. But the way she said it, the weight she put into it, the change in register made him go very still. "Yes," he said. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I don't know how to." She paused, and he watched her, searching for honest words. "I knew how marriage was supposed to work, and what I found was that the version I was given was a trap built from someone else's fear and need, and I don't know if what I know about love is trustworthy." "It probably isn't," he said. "Not completely. Not yet." She looked at him. "I'm not in any particular hurry," he said. "And I'm not Gerald Prout, and I am not interested in any version of this that isn't entirely your choice, freely made. I'd rather wait a year for your trust than take an inch of it that wasn't genuinely offered." The lamp on the Gazette's front table threw warm, uneven light across the space between them. Outside, snow was beginning to fall in the slow, soft way of Colorado December, sifting against the window in whispers. "That's a rather extraordinary thing to say," she said. "I mean it," he said. She crossed the space between them in 3 steps and stood before him and looked up at him in that direct, searching way she had, as if she were checking the truth of what she'd heard against what she could see in his face. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because after a long moment she reached up and placed her palm flat against his chest, just below his collarbone, and left it there. He covered her hand with his gently and did not move. "All right," she said, quiet, certain. "All right." Christmas in Redemption in 1883 was modest by most standards and lovely by the standards of the frontier. There was a community gathering at the church on Christmas Eve, to which approximately 2/3 of the town came, the other third being occupied at the Silver Spur, which held its own separate but enthusiastic celebration. Herbert Odom played the church organ with more enthusiasm than skill. The schoolteacher, a young woman named Agnes Pryor, organized the children into a performance of varying degrees of chaos that was received with universal warmth. Eunice Crane produced 4 pies from somewhere and refused to explain the mechanics of this achievement. Matilda sat beside Clayton in a pew near the back. This was noticed by everyone in Redemption and discussed at some length after the service, though not in their hearing. Eunice Crane told her friend Martha Hooper that it was about time. Clayton's deputy, a man named Fisk who was 22, and devoted to his employer with a loyalty that occasionally expressed itself as well-intentioned meddling, told anyone who would listen that the sheriff deserved to be happy, and that he personally thought Matilda Wells was the finest woman in the county. Herbert Odom, who was perhaps the only person whose opinion truly mattered on the subject, said nothing to anyone but worked with particular cheerfulness for the next week, and gave Matilda a small Christmas bonus that he announced was unrelated to anything, and then blushed and changed the subject. What no one knew, because neither Clayton nor Matilda was inclined to report on the interior of their lives to the public, was what had happened after the Christmas Eve service, when they walked back through the snow-covered town and stopped outside the boarding house. Clayton had looked at her in the blue-white light of the snow and the stars and said, "I'd like to court you properly." "If that's acceptable." She tilted her head at him. There was snow in her hair where a flake had caught and settled. "Define properly." "Honestly," he said, "openly, take meals with you when you'll have me, walk with you when you want company, talk with you which you know I enjoy, let the town know where." He paused. "Whatever we are, without pretense." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Without pretense," she repeated. I've had enough pretense to last several lifetimes." "I know," he said. "Yes," she said. "I believe you do." She looked up at him. "Properly, then, since you insist on being thoroughly decent about this." He laughed and she laughed, and the snow fell around them in the profound quiet of Christmas night, and something that had been very carefully, very deliberately, very honestly growing between them for months settled into a new and clearer shape. January was brutal in the way that Colorado January can be, with storms that came down from the Rockies and buried the town under 3 feet of snow in a single night, and temperatures that dropped to levels that made outdoor activity genuinely dangerous. There were 2 weeks in January where the only movement in redemption was strictly necessary, and the town turned inward and slow and close. Matilda and Clayton spent a significant portion of those 2 weeks together in the warmth of the Gazette office, which had a good iron stove, and later in the warmth of Eunice Crane's front parlor, because Eunice was a practical woman who understood that people needed human warmth in a Colorado winter, and that her chaperonage, while technically required by custom, was best performed from the next room where she could read her Bible in peace. They talked about everything. They talked about his childhood in Ohio, where his father had been a school teacher and his mother had kept a kitchen garden that produced vegetables of legendary quality. They talked about her childhood in Virginia, the daughter of a school teacher, which was a coincidence that made them both smile. They talked about what had brought them each west. His had been a deliberate choice, made at 22 after 2 years of reading about the territories, and deciding that a place still in the process of becoming was a place where a man might help shape what it became. Hers had been necessity that had transformed over miles and months into something more like choice. They talked about the future in careful, indirect ways at first, circling around it like two people approaching something they very much wanted but were afraid to frighten away. Then, as January wore on, less carefully. It was in the second week of January that Clayton told her about the thing he had been carrying for years. He told her about the night in 1880 when he had been a deputy in a town called Garrison, and there had been a fire at a boarding house, and he had pulled out 4 people, and had not been able to get back in for the 5th. The 5th had been a young girl, 7 years old, daughter of a traveling family. He had been carrying that night with him ever since. Not with paralysis. He had learned to function completely normally in its presence, but with the particular weight that some things put in you that you don't set down. Matilda listened to all of this without looking away. When he was done, she said, "You saved 4 people." "I know that," he said, "but you carry the one," she said. "Yes," he said, "so do I," she said. "There was a woman in St. Louis, a neighbor younger than me. I knew what her husband was doing to her. I tried to help her 3 times. She stayed. She's still there." A pause. "I tell myself I couldn't force her to leave, it's true, but I still carry it." He took her hand. She let him. "We carry things," she said. "It doesn't make us broken. It makes us people who paid attention." He thought about that for a long time. He thought about it many times afterward. It was characteristic of Matilda Wells that she could take a thing that had been a source of private pain and reframe it, not dismissively or falsely, but in a way that was genuinely, usefully true. February arrived in a slightly more generous mood than January, offering occasional days of thin winter sunshine that encouraged people back outdoors. Redemption blinked and shook itself, and began to function at its normal pace again. Clayton Barker proposed to Matilda Wells on the 14th of February, 1884, which he was aware was the kind of timing that would have embarrassed him in any other context, but which felt, in this case, simply accurate. He did it in the late afternoon in the Gazette office where she was reviewing galleys for the next issue by the light of the west window. He walked in, as he did almost every day now, and she looked up, and he said, "Will you marry me?" She set the galley down very carefully. She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze and did not fidget and did not apologize for the directness of the question. "I'll need to think about it," she said. "All right," he said. She thought about it for approximately 45 seconds. He counted because there was nothing else to do. "Yes," she said, "I will." He crossed the room and took her face in his hands and kissed her for the first time, and she kissed him back with the whole force of the months of patience and honesty and careful, deliberate trust they had built together. And it was, he thought, perhaps the truest thing that had ever happened to him. Herbert Odom, who had very quietly been aware of the proposal being planned and had arranged to be in the back room, made a significant noise, knocking something over that functioned as both congratulation and announcement. Matilda laughed against Clayton's mouth, and he held her, and thought that he did not deserve this and would spend the rest of his life trying to. They were married in March of 1884. The wedding was held in the Redemption Church on a Saturday when the first real warmth of the approaching spring was beginning to loosen the grip of winter on the land. Eunice Crane cried. Herbert Odom played the organ at an actually appropriate tempo for once. Deputy Fisk stood up very straight in his best shirt and felt the personal triumph of the event with particular intensity, given his investment in its outcome. Matilda wore the dark wool coat on the walk to the church because it was still cold enough in the morning, and she hung it on a hook inside the door and got married in a blue dress that she had made herself over the past weeks, with a focus and precision that Clayton had watched with admiring bewilderment at the construction of it. The dress was simple and perfectly made, and she was beautiful in it in the specific, serious, undecorative way that she was beautiful in everything, which was to say that the beauty was all hers and owed nothing to artifice. After the ceremony, walking back through the March mud and cold spring air, she took the coat from the hook and put it back on over the blue dress, and Clayton noticed this and said nothing, and she caught him noticing and smiled at him. "It was Clara's wedding too," she said, "in its way." He put his arm around her, coat and all. "Then Clara is welcome," he said. They had a proper wedding supper at Eunice Crane's, which Eunice had decided to host because she liked the occasion, and her dining room was the largest available. There were 12 people at the table, which was approximately 12 more than either Clayton or Matilda had expected, and it was warm and loud and full of the particular happiness of a frontier community celebrating one of its own. After everyone had gone home and the dishes were done, Clayton and Matilda walked to the house that had been Clayton's and was now theirs. It was a solid house, 2 rooms plus a kitchen, with a stone fireplace that drew well and a porch that faced west and caught the afternoon light. Matilda had been involved in getting it ready for 2 people, a process that had included strong opinions about the positioning of certain items of furniture and the addition of a bookshelf in the main room that was already, despite its newness, half full. They stood together in the main room with the fire going and the lamp turned low, and Clayton said, "Welcome home, Mrs. Barker." She was quiet for a moment. She was wearing the blue dress still, the coat hung by the door. She looked around the room, at the bookshelf, at the 2 chairs by the fire, at the small window that faced east and would catch the morning sun. "I haven't had a home," she said carefully, "in a long time. Not a real one." "You do now," he said. She turned and looked at him, and the expression on her face was something he would keep in him for the rest of his life, hope that had survived long enough to arrive, intact, at the place it had been moving toward. "I do now," she agreed, and came into his arms. Spring in Redemption was a revelation to Matilda. She had spent years in St. Louis, where spring arrived politely and in sequence, and a winter on the Colorado frontier, and the spring of 1884 broke open over the landscape with an exuberance that seemed to her almost violent in its generosity. The meadows outside town went from brown to gold to green in what seemed like days. The mountains still held their snow, but the valleys flooded with color, wildflowers appearing in the thin soil with an insistence that delighted her. She began walking early in the mornings, before the Gazette opened, partly for her own pleasure, and partly because she was gathering material for a series of natural history pieces that Herbert had agreed to run, which were proving surprisingly popular. People liked reading about the land they lived on. It made it more real to them, or confirmed a reality they had sensed but not articulated. Clayton sometimes walked with her and sometimes didn't, depending on what the morning required. He had learned, over their months together, that Matilda needed some time that was entirely her own, not because she wanted distance from him, but because she had spent 3 years having not a single hour that belonged to no one but herself, and the recovery from that was ongoing and real. He respected it completely. On the mornings she walked alone, she always came back with something, an observation, a story, sometimes a small wildflower tucked into her coat pocket that she'd set in the water glass on the Gazette desk. Life in Redemption in 1884 was not without its difficulties. In April, there was a flood when the creek that ran at the east edge of town overflowed its banks after a week of heavy rain, damaging the lower end of Main Street and 3 outbuildings. Everyone in town pitched in to address it, which was both exhausting and instructive about the community's character. Matilda wrote about it with the same honest attention she brought to everything, describing both the damage and the response with an eye for the specific and the human detail that made the Gazette's coverage worth reading. In May, there was trouble with a group of men from a larger operation to the north, who had been moving cattle through land that wasn't theirs and showing a particular interest in water sources. A different water source than the one the Harlow brothers were disputing, but part of the same general pattern of resource competition that was defining the territory in this period. Clayton dealt with it through a combination of legal process and steady, patient negotiation that prevented it from becoming the kind of situation it could have become. Matilda wrote about that, too, though carefully, because some of it was still legally active. The Harlow brothers' dispute was finally resolved in June by the circuit judge, in a ruling that split the water source access along a schedule that neither brother was entirely happy with, but that both could live with. Matilda had, over the preceding months, developed a genuine working relationship with both men through her reporting, and she was able to speak to each of them after the ruling and help them understand, separately, why accepting the compromise was more useful than continuing the fight. It was not her job. She did it anyway because she was that kind of person. It was also in June that she told Clayton she was pregnant. She told him in the morning before work, while they were drinking coffee by the kitchen window and the early light was lying flat and golden across the table between them. She said it simply and directly, as she said most things. "I'm expecting a child. Sometime around January, I think." He was very still for a moment. Then he set his coffee cup down and stood up and came around the table and held her. Just held her, his arms all the way around her and his face bent down to the crown of her head. She could feel that he was happy, not the noisy, demonstrative happiness that some men produced in these moments, but something deeper and more structural, as if something that had been under tension in him had released. "You're not frightened?" she asked. "Of course I am," he said into her hair. "Aren't you?" "Terrified," she said honestly. "But also, yes," he said. "Also." She pressed her face against his chest and held onto the lapels of his shirt and felt, for the first time in perhaps her entire life, that the terrifying thing was a thing she was heading toward freely and willingly, and with her whole self, not being driven toward by someone else's need or force. The pregnancy changed the rhythm of things in ways that Matilda found both practical and surprising. She continued working at the Gazette through the summer and into the fall, because she had things to write and no intention of letting the size of her abdomen determine her professional capacity, and Herbert Odom supported this with an enthusiasm that spoke well of him. She walked a little less far in the mornings and a little more slowly, and she developed strong opinions about the chair at the type case that Clayton heard about in satisfying detail over dinner. She also began, in the evenings, a project she had mentioned obliquely in the past. She was writing something longer, not for the Gazette, a proper account of her years in St. Louis and the journey west, not sensationalized but honest, the kind of document she wished she'd had to read when she was living it. She wrote it slowly and deliberately, a few pages at a time, and when she was ready she let Clayton read it. He read it in one sitting, late on a September evening while she worked on something else at the desk. When he was done, he looked up at her and she looked up at him and he said, "This is important." "It's just one woman's experience," she said. "That's exactly what makes it important," he said. "One woman's specific, honest experience." She published portions of it in the Gazette that fall, with Herbert's agreement, as a 4-part series. The response was significant. Letters arrived from women in 3 other towns who had read copies of the Gazette circulated through the territory. A woman in Pueblo wrote that she had read the first installment and wept because she had not known, before reading it, that anyone else understood what she was carrying. Matilda read that letter at the Gazette desk and was quiet for a long time. In December, with winter coming back down from the mountains, the Harlow brothers, separately and apparently, without coordinating with each other, brought firewood to Clayton and Matilda's house. It was an act of solidarity so unexpected that Matilda wrote it in her personal journal, not as a political story, but as a human one. The wood was stacked neatly on the porch, enough for several weeks of cold weather, and she thought about what it meant to live in a place long enough that the people around you began to consider themselves responsible for your warmth. Their son was born on the 15th of January, 1885. The birth was attended by Eunice Crane, who had practical experience with these things, and the town's doctor, a man named Mabry who was competent and kind. It was a difficult several hours, and Clayton, who had asked to stay and been allowed to because Matilda wanted him there, discovered that being the kind of man who remained calm in a crisis did not fully extend to this particular category of crisis, and he spent considerable time being very still and holding Matilda's hand and trying to be useful in ways that felt wholly inadequate to what she was doing. She was extraordinary. She was fierce and focused and determined in a way that should not have surprised him, given that he knew her, but that moved him profoundly nonetheless. When it was over and the baby was there breathing, present, making his opinion of the situation known in no uncertain terms, Clayton looked at Matilda and she looked at Clayton, both of them gray with exhaustion and bright with something that had no name that fit properly. "He's very loud," Matilda said, which were her first words. "He is," Clayton agreed. "He's all right?" she asked. "He's perfect," said Dr. Mabry. They named him James William Barker, for both their fathers, James for her father and William for his. He had dark hair that lay flat and fine against his head, and a quality of focused intensity in his expressions that Clayton suspected he had gotten from his mother, and that was already, at 2 days old, entirely recognizable. The first weeks with James were the particular exhaustion and wonder that are the universal experience of new parents in any era. Matilda, who had approached most things in her life with the reasonable expectation that she could learn them through attention and effort, found that the baby operated largely outside the parameters of learning and effort, and had his own entirely independent agenda. This frustrated and amused her in approximately equal measure. Clayton was more sanguine about the chaos, possibly because his work as a sheriff had long accustomed him to situations that refused to resolve on schedule. They developed a rhythm in shifts, which Matilda organized with the systematic precision she brought to the Gazette, and which worked considerably better than most systems devised at 2 in the morning, while a baby expressed himself forcefully in the background. Spring came again, and James went from being a creature of pure need to a creature of curiosity, which Matilda found deeply interesting. She began taking him with her on her morning walks in a sling that Eunice Crane helped her construct from a length of sturdy cotton. The baby regarded the world from this position, with a gravity that made people who encountered them on the road smile, involuntarily. Matilda returned to the Gazette part-time in March and full-time by May, with James occasionally present in a basket behind the typecase when no other arrangement was possible. Herbert Odom, who had never in his life entertained the presence of an infant in his working space, discovered that he did not mind it nearly as much as he would have predicted, and that James, when awake, showed a fascination with the sound of the press that was possibly hereditary. Life in Redemption in 1885 was also, for reasons beyond the personal, a period of significant change. The railroad spur that had been discussed for 2 years was confirmed, and construction began, which would bring the town into faster connection with the broader world and change its economy substantially. Matilda wrote about this extensively: the economic implications, the social ones, the complicated question of land acquisition along the rail route and whose land it was, and what they were being offered for it. She wrote, with particular care and specific research, about a section of the rail route that passed through an area where a family of Ute people had established a seasonal settlement for decades. The railroad company offered compensation that she calculated in the article was approximately 40% of what an equivalent property would command from a white seller. She named the numbers specifically. She included interviews, through an interpreter, with the family's elder, a man of remarkable dignity named Nakoa, who chose his words with care and permitted her to quote him directly. The article created a significant response. The railroad company wrote a formal letter of complaint to Herbert Odom, which Herbert read carefully, filed, and did not respond to. A territorial official came to Redemption and had a lengthy conversation with Clayton, whose jurisdiction it was technically, and Clayton said, with the patience he brought to all official conversations, that the article contained documented facts, and that if the official had evidence that any of those facts were incorrect, he was welcome to present it. The compensation offered to Nakoa's family was quietly revised upward by the railroad company before the matter reached any formal legal process. The revision was not as complete as Matilda would have wanted. It was more than it would have been without the article. She noted this in a follow-up piece with characteristic precision. Progress measured in real units, not celebration. Clayton read that piece and told her he was proud of her. "Don't get sentimental," she said, but she was smiling. "I'll be exactly as sentimental as I choose," he said. "You do important work." She set down what she was doing and looked at him, that look, the one he had never entirely gotten used to because it still landed with the same force it always had. "You've never tried to moderate me," she said, "or redirect me, or suggest that I was taking unnecessary risks with the work." "Why would I?" he said. "Gerald," she stopped herself. "I'm not Gerald," he said, "and I married you, Matilda, not an idea of you. The actual you, who writes what she thinks is true and important and doesn't particularly care about the political inconvenience of it. I wouldn't choose a different version." She came and put her arms around him. James balanced on her hip between them, and held on with a fierceness that he returned completely. The summer of 1885 brought unexpected joy in the form of a letter from Virginia. Matilda had a younger sister. She had mentioned once and only once in the early days, from whom she had been separated by the geography and politics of her marriage to Gerald Prout. The sister's name was Eleanor, and she was 22, and she had apparently, through the careful and persistent process of writing to every newspaper in Colorado, eventually written to the Redemption Gazette, and Herbert Odom had replied with the information she needed. The letter was waiting when Matilda arrived at the Gazette one morning in July, her name on the envelope in a handwriting she recognized instantly. Clayton was not there. He was dealing with a situation involving a runaway horse and a delivery wagon at the other end of town, and she opened the letter alone, which was probably as it should be. Eleanor had been looking for her for a year. Eleanor had finally left Virginia herself, married to a schoolteacher in Kansas, and she was healthy and safe, and she very much wanted to see her sister. Matilda sat at her desk in the Gazette and cried for the better part of 20 minutes, which was more than she had cried collectively in the preceding 2 years, and was still sitting there, composed again but red-eyed, when Clayton came in an hour later. He stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" She handed him the letter. He read it. He set it down carefully. He sat on the edge of the desk across from her chair and looked at her. "Eleanor," he said. "Eleanor," she said, "can she come here?" I'm going to write to her immediately, Matilda said. And I'm going to suggest that she and her husband visit in the fall, and then I'm going to ask Herbert if he'll excuse me for the time it takes to arrange a letter in which I say everything I've wanted to say to her for 3 years. He'll excuse you, Clayton said. I know he will, she said. She looked up at him. Clayton. I know, he said. He came around the desk and crouched beside her chair so they were at eye level. I know. Go write the letter. She took his face in her hands, ink-stained, warm, certain. Thank you, she said. For what? For being the kind of man I can say thank you to without it feeling like gratitude for the minimum, she said. He turned his face slightly and kissed her palm. Go write the letter. Eleanor Marsh, née Wells, now Eleanor Marsh of her schoolteacher husband Thomas, came to redemption in September of 1885, and the reunion between the sisters was a private thing that Matilda kept private in the specific way she reserved for the things that mattered most to her. Clayton met Eleanor and liked her immediately. She had the same quality of direct attention, though expressed differently, more warmth and less calculation, as if the same inheritance had been distributed in alternate proportions between them. Eleanor and Thomas stayed 2 weeks. Thomas and Clayton discovered a shared interest in landscape geology, which was perhaps the most unexpected development of the visit, and spent 2 long afternoons riding out to look at rock formations, while their wives sat in the parlor with James between them, and talked with the focused intensity of people who had a great deal of lost time to address. On the last evening of the visit, all 4 of them sat on the porch after dinner with the September night coming down over the mountains in shades of purple and deep blue, and James slept in the crook of Matilda's arm, and Eleanor said with a look at her sister, "You're happy." "Yes," Matilda said, "really happy, not the managing kind." "Really happy," Matilda said. "I didn't expect it particularly, but yes." Eleanor looked at Clayton. "She told me something once a long time ago," she said. She said that if she could choose any life, she would choose one where she was allowed to be entirely herself, where she didn't have to perform a smaller version. "I know," Clayton said. "Are you giving her that?" "I'm trying to," he said. "She mostly gives it to herself. I just try not to get in the way." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled at her sister with a private warmth that contained years of knowing each other. "He's right about the giving it to yourself part," she said to Matilda. "I know," Matilda said. It took a while to believe it was allowed. The railroad came through in late 1885 and changed redemption in the ways Matilda had predicted, bringing more people, more commerce, more complexity. The town grew through 1886 in ways that required adjustment. There were new businesses, new residents, new disputes and complications of the kind that come with growth, and Clayton's workload expanded accordingly. He hired a second deputy and spent considerable time that year advocating for the proper jail that the territorial marshal had been requesting, which was finally built in the spring of 1886 as a solid adobe building with 3 cells, proper ventilation, and a separate room for the deputy on duty. Matilda and Herbert hired a printer's assistant at the Gazette, a young man named Cole who was enthusiastic and capable, and who within a year was writing his own pieces under Matilda's supervision. She was, it turned out, a natural teacher with the same quality she brought to everything, the capacity to see what someone needed and provide exactly that rather than something approximate. Life settled into a depth and richness that Matilda recognized, sometimes, with a quality of wonder that 3 years earlier would have seemed naive to her. It was not a perfect life. There were arguments between her and Clayton, real arguments, the kind that come between people who have strong minds and genuine convictions, and are honest enough not to manage their differences into silence. There were difficult weeks at the Gazette and difficult months at the sheriff's office and difficult nights when James was ill, and one or both of them was running on no sleep. But there was also the late evenings by the fire when they talked about everything, finishing each other's thoughts not because they had merged, but because they had learned each other deeply. There was the continuing practice of the morning walks, which she now sometimes took with James on her back, and sometimes with Clayton beside her, and sometimes alone, because all three were right at different times. There was the shelf of books that had expanded from half a shelf to 2 full walls of a room they had added to the house when James began walking and requiring more space to conduct his energetic investigations of the world. There was the coat. The coat hung by the door of the house, and had hung there since the day they moved in together. It was older now and more worn, but Matilda had repaired it carefully, the cuffs replaced, a tear in the lining mended with close, even stitches. She still wore it in the winter. She wore it on the mornings when something felt uncertain, or when a piece she was writing was difficult, and she needed to walk through it slowly in the cold air. Clayton had understood its significance long before she told him directly. He had simply accepted it as part of what she was, and had never, not once, looked at it with anything resembling a challenge or a question. He simply understood that some things we carry are not burdens exactly but companions, reminders of who helped us become who we are. Clara Hendricks, who had died of influenza innocent. Louis Winter had given her coat to a young woman who needed warmth and courage, and the young woman had carried it 400 miles into the wilderness of the West and had built a life with it on her back, and had found a man who understood without being told that honoring the things we carry is part of honoring the person who carries them. He had never asked about the coat in the beginning. He had simply admired it, admired the person inside it, and let the rest come in its own time. She told him, one evening in the spring of 1887, the complete story of Clara. All of it, not the compressed version from their November walk in 1883, but the full account. Clara's small acts of courage during Matilda's marriage. The cup of tea left on the back step on the mornings when things had been worst, with no note, because no note was necessary. The quiet, steady witness of another woman who saw and understood and could not fix but could be present. The influenza that took her in 2 weeks of February cold. The husband standing among her things, overwhelmed and lost. The coat that Matilda had taken not as theft but as continuation, as if wearing it was a way of saying that Clara's particular brand of quiet courage was not ending with her life, but going forward in someone else's. Clayton listened to all of it with his particular quality of attention that had always made her feel that what she was saying was worth the saying. When she finished, there was a long quiet. "She sounds like someone worth honoring," he said. "She was," Matilda said. "She was entirely ordinary in most respects, and entirely extraordinary in what she chose to do with that ordinariness." "Most courage is like that," he said. She looked at him. "Is this where I tell you that I find the parallels somewhat obvious?" He smiled. "I'm not trying to make a point." "You're always trying to make a point," she said warmly. "You're just very good at making it seem like an observation." He laughed and she laughed, and James, who was 2 years old and had apparently decided this was an appropriate moment to wake from his nap, contributed his own opinion from the next room in a tone that was both clarion and imperative. The second child came in 1888. Matilda told Clayton with the same directness she had used the first time, on a Sunday morning in March when the window was showing the first real warmth of the approaching spring. "Another one," she said. "October, I think." He looked at her for a moment with the same quality of deep stillness she had come to recognize as his form of the most profound emotion. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Remarkably well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, otherwise functional." "And otherwise?" She considered the question. "Otherwise," she said, "I feel as though life is being very generous and I am not certain I have earned it, but I am choosing to accept it anyway." He reached across the breakfast table and took her hand. "You've earned everything," he said. "You're biased," she said. "Completely," he agreed. The second baby arrived in October of 1888, a girl this time, and they named her Clara. It was Matilda's decision and Clayton's wholehearted agreement. Clara Barker, for the woman who had left her coat in the right hands at the right time. Clara with Matilda's dark hair and Clayton's gray eyes, and an expression in her first months that was so profoundly serious she made everyone who looked at her feel they were being evaluated. James, at 3.5, regarded his sister with the considering attention of someone who has not yet decided how to classify a new phenomenon. He progressed through wariness to acceptance to, eventually, a proprietary affection that manifested as standing between Clara's basket and any approaching stranger with his small arms spread, which Clayton found both amusing and recognizable. Life in Redemption continued its expansion. The town had grown enough by 1889 to require a mayor and an expanded town council, and there were elections with real stakes about the direction of the growing community. Matilda covered these elections in the Gazette with her characteristic refusal to pretend that politics was neutral or that power was evenly distributed. She made enemies in doing this. She also made the coverage worth reading, and the Gazette's circulation had expanded steadily enough that Herbert Odom's experiment in frontier journalism was no longer struggling at all. Clayton was re-elected sheriff in 1889 without opposition, which he considered less a tribute to his personal popularity than to the consistent effort of 3 years of methodical, unglamorous, effective work. There were men who thought the territory should handle itself by tougher means, who thought the growing complexity of redemption required a more forceful style of law. Clayton disagreed and continued to disagree, and was proven right often enough that the argument was difficult to sustain against him. He and Matilda talked about it on the evening of the election, the children already asleep, the fire low in the grate. "You could leave the badge," she said, not suggesting it, just noting it as possible. "I could," he said. "Do you want me to?" "I want what you want," she said, "within reason. I still believe in what the job is supposed to be," he said, "the theory of it if not always the practice. A person placed between a community and the worst it might do to itself. I think I do it reasonably well." "You do it very well," she said, "but it takes from you." "Everything worth doing takes from you," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "That's true." She looked at him across the low light of the fire. "Do you know what I find remarkable about you?" "Any number of things, I hope," he said. "You say yes to things," she said. "That sounds simple, but you say yes to the difficult things, the things that require you with the same equanimity you bring to the easy ones. You don't perform sacrifice. You don't build monuments out of your service." "My mother would have found monument building insufferable," he said. "Your mother was a wise woman," Matilda said. He looked at her with such open, steady affection that she felt it physically, as a warmth distinct from the fire. "She would have liked you enormously," he said. "I would have liked her," she said. "Now come to bed. You've been re-elected and I have a Gazette to put out tomorrow, and Clara was up twice last night, which I believe means it's your morning shift." "My morning shift," he confirmed, without complaint, and banked the fire, and followed his wife to bed. 1890 brought the closure of what remained open from Matilda's past. A letter came from St. Louis, from an attorney, informing her that the entirety of Gerald Pruitt's estate had been finally and legally settled, with her portion dispersed as established by the original documentation she had filed in 1883. The amount was modest but real, and she deposited it in the Redemption Bank and used a portion of it for a purpose she had been considering for some time. She purchased a proper press for the Gazette. A new one, not the aged, temperamental machine that Herbert had been coaxing through each issue for years. She and Herbert went together to the train station to receive it, and it arrived in a crate of such impressive size that it attracted a crowd. And when it was installed and running its first job, a Tuesday edition, nothing special, Herbert Odom stood beside it and ran his hand along its frame with the expression of a man who has been given, unexpectedly and after a long time, something he had believed he was too old to receive. "You didn't have to," he told Matilda. "I know," she said. "That's why." She had also, in the months preceding this, made a decision about the coat. She kept wearing it. She would always keep wearing it. But she had, over the winter of 1889, written something new, not for the Gazette, not her original account. A proper dedication, written in the front of a bound journal in her clearest hand. To Clara Hendricks, who chose to be present when she could have looked away. Who wore her courage quietly and left it behind for someone who needed it. She left the journal with the coat. When she wore the coat, both things went with her. James was 5 in January of 1890 and had developed a passionate interest in rocks that owed something to Clayton's conversations with Thomas Marsh on their long-ago afternoon excursion, and something to Matilda's natural history pieces in the Gazette, and a great deal to his own particular intensity of attention toward the world. He would bring specimens from the creek bed and the field behind the house and arrange them with a methodical seriousness that both his parents found both genuinely impressive and quietly hilarious. He was going to be a geologist or a scholar or possibly both, Clayton said. Matilda said he was going to be whatever he decided to be, which was exactly the same thing but more accurate. Clara at 2 was entirely her own person, an assessment that was delivered by every adult who encountered her, and that Matilda received with equal parts pride and profound unsurprise. Clara had already a quality of social intelligence that was striking. She could read the mood of a room at 2 years old in a way that was simultaneously practical and generous, moving toward whoever needed attention, and being gently present with them in a way that made you think of the name she carried. In the spring of 1890, on a May afternoon of great beauty, the mountains sharp with late snow against a sky of extraordinary blue, the meadows below them green and gold, and covered in wildflowers, Clayton Barker came home in the middle of the afternoon, which was unusual, and found Matilda on the porch of the house with Clara on her lap and James at her feet, constructing an elaborate geological survey of the porch steps. She looked up at him with the slight alertness she always felt when something was outside its usual pattern. "Everything all right? Everything is more than all right," he said. He sat down beside her on the porch bench and looked out at the mountains. James continued his survey. Clara regarded her father from her mother's lap with the evaluating gravity that had characterized her from birth. "I was thinking," he said, "about 7 years ago, when you came in on the stage from Pueblo. With no luggage to speak of," she said. "And that coat," he said. She glanced at him. "The coat was inside today, warm enough to leave it, but they both knew exactly where it was. I never asked about it," he said. "You know that." "I know," she said. "But I noticed it," he said. "From the first day, there was something about the way you wore it. Like it belonged to someone who had earned it," she said. "Like it was carrying something," he said. "Like you were both carrying it and being carried by it at the same time." She was quiet for a moment, listening to this. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly right. I just wanted you to know," he said, "that I noticed, even when I didn't ask." She looked at him then, this man who had never demanded an explanation, who had never tried to categorize or contain her, who had simply opened space for her to exist in fully and had stood steady in that space every day for 7 years. Who had re-elected himself every morning to the project of being trustworthy, who had admired her without requiring her to perform the thing he admired. "I know you noticed," she said. "You were always noticing." "You're extraordinary," he said. He said it simply, not as flattery. "So are you," she said with equal simplicity. James looked up from his survey. "What are you talking about?" he asked with the bluntness of a 5-year-old. "Nothing important," Matilda said. "Everything important," Clayton said at the same moment. James looked between them, assessed the situation as beyond his current area of interest, and went back to the rocks. Clara reached up and patted Matilda's face with a small, deliberate hand. The mountain stood over them in the clean blue air of Colorado spring, vast and old and indifferent in the way that only makes the small human things happening before them more precious by contrast. Matilda Wells had come west in a dead woman's coat with a living woman's courage. She had walked into a small, struggling town at the end of a long road, and had built a life there that was entirely, genuinely, irrevocably her own. She had loved and been loved without subtraction or demand. She had written the truth in a newspaper that people read because she wrote it true. She had made a home that felt like a home, raised a son who collected rocks with scientific devotion, given her daughter the name of a woman who deserved to be remembered, and found in all of this the thing she had not quite dared to name when she was running, not safety, exactly, though she had that, but liberty. The liberty of being known fully and chosen specifically, exactly as she was. In the years that followed, there were more seasons in redemption, each one layering something new over what had come before. There was a third pregnancy, announced in the autumn of 1891, that ended in a loss they grieved privately and deeply and together in the particular way that loss shared between two people who love each other does not diminish either of them, but binds them more closely at the broken places. And there was a fourth, in 1893, that arrived healthy and loud, and with red hair that mystified both of them, until Matilda remembered a red-haired aunt on her mother's side, and they named the baby Thomas Edmund Barker, and Clayton called him Red before the boy was a week old, and the name stuck past all official alternatives. James collected rocks and developed into a boy of extraordinary intellectual precision who asked questions that left the school teacher, and then the circuit teachers who came afterward, and then the books that Clayton ordered specifically from Denver, working to keep up with him. Clara was, by the time she was 5, the child who all the other children came to when they were hurt or confused, not because she was older but because she had that quality. Red was simply joyful in a way that required no further analysis. The Gazette grew, and Herbert Odom grew old in it with dignity and satisfaction, and in 1895 he told Matilda that he intended to retire, that his hands were no longer reliable for the press work, and that he had been thinking about what to do with the paper. She did not immediately understand. "It's yours," he said. "Has been in practice for years. Now formally, if you'll take it." She sat with this for a long moment. Then she said, "Herbert, this is your paper." "It's your paper," he said. "I just owned it first." She took it. She ran it honestly, as she had always run everything, and it continued to be worth reading because she continued to insist on that above all else. Cole, the printer's assistant who had become a proper journalist under her supervision, became her colleague and eventually her co-editor. The Gazette became, in the language of the territory, a paper of record for the region, trusted, cited, reprinted, argued with. Clayton retired the badge in 1897 when he was 42 and the town had grown enough to require a different kind of law infrastructure, a structure he had helped design, and that his successor, a man he had trained for 2 years specifically for the purpose, stepped into. He became, in the years after, a man of varied and useful occupations. He sat on the town council. He managed the family's modest property interests, which had grown as redemption grew. He helped Matilda with the Gazette in the capacity of business manager, which was a role that suited him, and that she described, to his amusement, as precisely as useful as having someone who is reliably calm stand next to something that is occasionally on fire. They grew into their middle years together in the specific, rich, contented way of two people who have chosen each other repeatedly and deliberately, and who have never stopped finding the other genuinely interesting. They disagreed still, and argued when argument was warranted, and had long evenings of conversation about the world and its complications that James, and then Clara, and then Red joined as they grew old enough, so that what had begun as a dialogue between two people became a family conversation that expanded and deepened across years and mealtimes and porch evenings. The coat remained. It was old by the late 1890s, truly old, the kind of well-worn that is its own form of beauty. Matilda had repaired it many times. She still wore it in the deepest Colorado winters, on the early morning walks she still took, older but unchanged in their essential purpose and pleasure. Clara Barker, who was 9 years old in 1897, asked about it one winter morning when Matilda was putting it on before her walk. "Whose was it before yours?" she asked. Clara asked that kind of question directly and without preamble, which was characteristic. Matilda paused, the coat half on. She looked at her daughter, the gray eyes, the serious face, the quality of open attention she had been carrying since before she could walk. "A woman named Clara," she said, "who was brave in small, important ways and who was my friend when I needed one." Her daughter looked at this with great seriousness. "So I'm named for her." "You are," Matilda said. "What was she like?" Matilda thought about Clara Hendricks, the cup of tea on the back step, the quiet presence, the February illness that had taken her too young. She thought about what it had meant to put on that coat for the first time on the road out of St. Louis, cold and frightened and more determined than she had ever been about anything. She was ordinary, she said, entirely ordinary, and she chose every day to be kind and present and honest, which made her extraordinary. Her daughter was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Like you." Matilda looked at her. "You think I'm ordinary." "I think you're extraordinary," Clara said, with the precision of someone who has followed the logic. "So that means you must be very ordinary too." Matilda laughed and pulled her daughter into her arms, coat and all, and held her for a long, warm moment in the cold morning air of the house. On a September morning in 1900, when the aspens along the creek were going gold, and the air had the specific crystalline quality of Colorado fall, Matilda and Clayton sat together on the porch of their house, as they had sat on many September mornings across 17 years. James was 15, and at school in Denver on a scholarship that had delighted everyone and surprised no one. Clara was 12 and running what amounted to an informal counseling service for the children of Redemption's now substantial community, while officially simply being in school. Red was 7 and had recently decided he was going to be a cowboy, which Clayton said was a perfectly fine aspiration, and Matilda said was negotiable pending further information. The morning light lay across the town and the meadows and the mountains the same way it had always laid across them, indifferent to the human drama below, beautiful in its indifference. Matilda had her coffee and Clayton had his, and they were not talking, which was a comfortable state between them that had taken years to perfect. After a while she said, "Do you remember what you said to me on the porch, that spring day in 1890? "I remember everything," he said. "You said I came west in a coat that was carrying something." "That was true," he said. "I've been thinking about it," she said, "because James asked me last month before he left for Denver what I thought I'd carried west with me. He was writing something for school about the settlement of the frontier and he wanted a personal account." "What did you tell him?" She was quiet for a moment. The aspens shimmered in the slight morning wind. "I told him I'd carried fear and courage and grief and hope, and a coat that belonged to a woman who reminded me that small acts done consistently are the material of a life, and that somewhere along the way I'd put down most of the fear and the grief had become something I carried differently, not a weight but a way of paying attention, and that I'd found—" She paused. "What?" he asked. "I told him I'd found that the West was what it was, complicated and unjust and beautiful and real, and that I'd found within it one person who looked at me and saw exactly what was there and stayed anyway, and that this had been the most significant thing that had ever happened to me." Clayton set his coffee cup down. "He asked who the person was," Matilda said, "and I said his father." Clayton looked at her. The light was in her hair, which was beginning to show gray at the temples in a way that she regarded with equanimity and that he found beautiful. She was 43 years old. She was the exact same person she had been when she walked off the stage in Redemption 17 years ago, only more so, more herself, more certain, more open to the world rather than braced against it. "Matilda," he said. "Yes," she said. "I would do it again," he said. "Everything, any day we chose and any day we didn't, all of it." She looked at him. The same look she had given him across the plaster dust in the saloon at the beginning of all of it, measuring, calculating, and then certain. "So would I," she said, "every single day." She reached over and took his hand on the porch railing, and they sat together in the gold October morning, while their youngest son ran in circles in the yard below explaining his cowboy plans to the dog, and the mountains stood overhead in their ancient, reliable beauty, and Redemption spread out around them. The town they had both come to and had, in the way that two people sometimes do, helped become what it was: a little more just, a little more honest, a little more worth believing in than it might otherwise have been. The coat hung inside on its hook. Clara Hendricks had given a coat to a woman who needed courage, and the woman had carried it 400 miles to the edge of the world, and had worn it into a sheriff's office and a newspaper and a wedding and a life, and had loved and been loved truly, and had written the truth and raised children, and sat on porches in the morning light for 17 years with a man who asked about neither the coat nor the courage, because he had always, from the first moment, simply admired both. It was, as lives go, exactly enough. It was, as lives go, more than enough. It was, in the end, everything.